Greetings. I'm Bonnie Nicholas, Director of CRC Safe Church Ministry, and I'm thrilled today to introduce Linda Crockett. I first became aware of Linda while doing some research on the internet. Then I read her book, which is not an easy read, but really helps show what an amazing woman she is. And I first met Linda face to face in December of 2014 near her home in Pennsylvania. I was visiting extended family there, and she graciously agreed to meet me over lunch. And right away, we discovered a shared passion for preventing child sexual abuse and for involving churches and faith communities in the endeavor. The next spring, Carol, our Safe Church administrative specialist, and I traveled to Georgia to attend a Samaritan Safe Church training, which Linda led. We were so impressed at the comprehensive nature of the program, the material she had written and gathered for this 3-day training, and her ideas about working in clusters, about involving survivors in leading the work, and thinking in terms of movement building just made so much sense. We thought, we need these ideas in CRC Safe Church. So I was so excited when she agreed to come speak as part of our Safe Church conference. And I'm so thankful that she's willing to make this recording work by redoing a part of it that was not recorded because of a glitch in the system. So we're just so thankful to be able to have this, and I'm excited because I believe that she will inspire us. And our prayer is that we would together be involved in building a movement to end child sexual abuse. This goes way beyond the CRC. And it's something that churches need to take a stand against. So I'm thrilled that you are here, Linda, listening. I'm thrilled that you are here listening to this recording, and I'm thrilled that Linda is here to share her vision with us. The recording will switch to the live version about halfway through, so you can look forward to that. And our prayer is, when we pray, your kingdom come, we are praying for an end to child sexual abuse. So may the Lord use this recording to further his kingdom. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Linda. Thank you, and may the Lord continue to bless the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. It is wonderful to be here at your gathering and to be talking about a movement to end child sexual abuse that is a faith-based movement that is starting to emerge all across the country. And I am very excited to be sharing with you not simply about our work, but also to be inviting you to think about how you can engage some of these ideas in your own Safe Church work in your CRC ministries. Samaritan Safe Church was born at Samaritan Counseling Center. We're a faith-based center in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we provide theologically integrated and clinical counseling. And also we have a variety of programming that we offer out to churches of many traditions and many denominations. And Safe Church got started at Samaritan, but before I talk more about Safe Church, I really wanted to share with you a little bit about my own story, about how I came to be at Samaritan and how it was that I came to start this Safe Church program in 2011. So in 2003, I left what had been about a 20-year corporate career, and I came to Samaritan Center, and I came there after I had done some work for a number of years with refugees in war zones in El Salvador, Central America. And that work had radically transformed me And I wanted to move out of the corporate world in which I had been immersed while I was doing this volunteer work and find a place where I could contribute to ending sexual violence and helping survivors find their voice. Because I am a survivor myself, and I really had to face the reality and the pain of my own history when I was working in El Salvador, which was really the first social justice movement that I ever became involved with. It was during the war in the 1980s, and it was a war in which tens of thousands of civilians had been killed. And the US government was channeling military aid, which was being used in many cases to kill people in poor communities and to fund the shadowy death squads. And I became involved there because I was responding to a call from Salvadoran Lutheran Bishop Medardo Gomez to North American Christians to come and accompany his people who were suffering not only from the military violence but extreme poverty based on structural oppression. You know, a poor community was safer if there were U.S. nationals there to be present to accompany them, because this was in the days before social media or even email and the internet. You know, it was just kind of starting back then. And the death of one of us would make international news, while the murder of a dozen campesinos, you know, poor farmers, wouldn't even cause a ripple. And at that point in my life, I probably couldn't have even found El Salvador on a map, but I was so moved by that call from Bishop Gomez, who said that his people were walking the way of the cross and they needed other Christians to help them carry it. And so, moved by my faith, along with other people from central Pennsylvania, helped to form a grassroots organization we called Project Via Crucis, in Spanish, the Way of the Cross, to accompany Salvadorans in war zones. Now, I had always remembered being molested by a teenage cousin and two of his friends for almost an entire summer when I was 5. I had always remembered being raped, gang raped, by a group of men, with my best friend at my side who was also raped when we were 15. And I remember more about the horror of watching her being raped than I remember about my own rape. But I had never told anyone about these things because, like many survivors, I didn't think it mattered what happened to me. And it wasn't until I began to work in El Salvador in '87, accompanying refugees and survivors of torture, that I began to remember my own long buried memories of childhood sexual abuse by my mother as well as other people. You know, I began suffering nightmares and flashbacks, and I had tried hard for a few years during this time in El Salvador to stuff them back behind the walls I built as a child in order to survive. I really wanted to focus my energy on walking with the mothers of the disappeared as we searched the body dumps for their loved ones who had been taken by death squads that operated with impunity. I wanted to put my own body on the line to help protect the people in defiance of our U.S. policies, which were killing so many innocents as they bombed whole communities in Vietnam-era scorched earth tactics. But you know, my activist self, my survivor self in those days, believed I was not important, that I just wanted to focus on building a better world for other people, not for me. But the Salvadoran people that I grew to love not only opened my own eyes to my pain and my history, but gave me the courage and the hope that I needed to uncover my own history and to heal and to find my own voice. You know, in El Salvador, I encountered the God who weeps at the exploitation of the most vulnerable, who is outraged at those who abuse their power, the God who walks with those who suffer, the God who dances with you between the bombing raids, because Salvadorans in these communities, when there was a clear night and it seemed as though things would be okay, they would bring out musical instruments and we found moments of joy in the midst of all of the horror. And this God was just embodied in the Salvadoran people that I accompanied, who in this long process came to accompany me. So it was after that time that I left my corporate career and I came to Samaritan after making a big midlife transition so that I could bring up a program that would help to support survivors of violence within their families. And so as we turn to our agenda this morning, I just wanted to share some of that with you because one of my practices now as a survivor leader is to be open with my own story when I'm speaking to people because I want you to know why this work deeply matters to me. So as we talk this morning, part one, we'll be looking on what is movement building exactly. It's not terminology that is perhaps familiar to everyone. And we'll talk a little bit about how shifting culture is a core work within movement building. We'll talk about the impact of CSA or child sexual abuse, short term on children and longer term on adults as they have moved into decades of life carrying deep pain that is mostly invisible to others. We'll talk about our approach and our vision with Samaritan Safe Church, about how narrative leadership, telling stories, is part of movement building. And after that, we're going to pivot, and we're going to pivot into a deeper dive. And we'll talk more specifically about what do we mean by culture shift and movement building. Let's look a little deeper. What are the categories or the buckets of change that Samaritan Safe Church is designed to work within? The big question, if you're looking at shifting culture, how do you know it's working? It's a very difficult thing to measure, and so I'll share with you how we determined how we could measure that. And we determined that we would hold a convening, a gathering of leaders from all of the many churches, more than 50 churches locally, that we worked with over 5 years to look at culture shift, and I'll talk about that. And then I'll conclude with how we can take action together, because this work is not about scaling up any one program or way of working. It's about people of faith from many traditions coming together and stepping up to be leaders to end child sexual abuse. So we have a big agenda. We actually got our start with Safe Church with a small grant from the Ms. Foundation for Women. And the Ms. Foundation has been around for many years. If anybody is old enough to remember, for example, Marlo Thomas from That Girl, she was one of the founders. And it's a foundation that works on behalf of women to gain equality and help women in many aspects of their lives. And in 2010, they concluded several years of research where they looked at what are the most important issues that women are facing and what can we do to help. And what they concluded after doing field scans and research was that one of the most important things we can do to improve women's lives across the lifespan is to end child sexual abuse. Because child sexual abuse can put a woman, as well as certainly a man, on a trajectory that impacts their lives for decades to come. And this foundation concluded that more than any other single thing they could do, this was very important to invest in because it has such an incredibly detrimental long-term impact. And so they're a big national foundation. We're a relatively small counseling center in Lancaster. We weren't sure we would have a chance, but we submitted a proposal to them, and they were looking for programs that focused on shifting culture in this country, norms, values, behaviors, so that we could end CSA. And we made the argument that people of faith have got to be at the table if we want to talk about shifting culture in this country. And they agreed with us. And so we were one of about 18 projects that they funded beginning in 2011 and then supported us until 2015. And during those 5 years, I worked in a leadership cohort with secular leaders, mostly from across the country, that were also working to end child sexual abuse and engaged in building a national social movement. One of the problems that the church often has is that it works in a silo. But we cannot end CSA by staying in our silos. It's going to require a systemic approach to shifting culture, while at the same time creating policies and practices to sustain that shift, that movement. It means we have to get beyond our notions that we can fix this with education and awareness raising and services after the fact. We have got to change culture, which is social norms, values, and behaviors. Education and awareness raising, research, it's all good, but it is not going to end child sexual abuse, not in and of itself. For that, we need to look at culture change, and that is, in fact, the core work of social movement building. So a social movement can have many different definitions, but a good basic one is that a movement is large, sometimes informal, groups of individuals or organizations that are focused on a specific political or social change. Movements are able to address really complex social issues that can't be easily fixed by a single solution. We can't create any one program, and we can't have any one entity, whether that is a church or a school or the criminal justice system, fix this issue. People need to work together to change the conditions that allow so many kids, 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys, to be sexually abused before they reach 18. So social movements don't only educate people, they really inspire people. They touch their hearts with fire to take action in their own communities and beyond to challenge the status quo that allows these conditions to exist and to bring about the necessary changes. That is a social movement. So you might ask why? Why a social movement specifically to end child sexual abuse? Well, we believe that CSA has lived between the cracks and among other movements for a couple of decades. You know, it's been part of the domestic violence movement. It's been part of the sexual assault movement. It's part of child abuse. And while we honor all of those intersections, we believe the time has come to organize specifically to end child sexual abuse. I did a presentation for a large organization that focuses on ending child abuse a couple of years back. And I was presenting mostly to people in their leadership and people who are doing their on the ground work. And my workshop was focused on child sexual abuse. And a number of the people commented that they don't think at their conference they had ever had a workshop specifically focused on child sexual abuse before. Almost everything in the child abuse prevention movement is more focused on physical abuse and neglect, and the sexual aspects are more marginalized, perhaps because it's so difficult to talk about. So in this movement, we are lifting out and holding up child sexual abuse as worthy of deserving our attention in a movement. And Safe Church is one stream of many streams that will converge in a mighty river as we build a sustainable social movement to shift the cultural norms around CSA. And I would say over the past 5 years that I have worked with the Ms. Foundation's cohort, working with national leaders, having a view of other states and other communities. Progress is definitely being made. We have a long way to go, but progress is being made towards catalyzing that movement, and a movement is in fact starting to take shape, and that is very exciting. I think it's critical that we engage people of faith, congregations, in this movement. You know, in a congregation, we have an opportunity to impact large numbers of people that are in community with each other on a somewhat regular basis, week in and week out. And I think also by calling on common Christian values and using biblical narratives, such as, the Exodus narrative, where God wants people to be free from the chains that bind them. God wants people to be free from the chains of child sexual abuse. We can inspire people of faith to become proactive in preventing the sexual abuse of children in their churches and in their communities. We don't want this to stay within the church walls. We want to equip people of faith to take it out into the community. And finally, I would say people of faith were key in past social movements. We need only to look at ending slavery or civil rights. And I believe when our faith grounds a commitment to social change, we can put down really deep roots because it's based in something bigger than us. It's based in a command or a vision from God. And there is significant staying power available for long-term work. It would be hard for me to imagine how to do this work without my faith in God and without being rooted in that faith, because this is hard. And it's not easy, and it's work for the long term. It's a lot more like a marathon than it is a sprint. And as I've traveled around the country talking to people of faith in many different communities, I am finding so many people that are sitting in the pews have been quietly feeling ashamed. Ashamed because the church, and I'm not talking about any one denomination, I'm talking about the church at large, has been in the news far too often for our failures to protect children. We see it time and time again across all denominations and traditions. And I found that people of faith are tired of feeling ashamed. There are some churches that parents, are hesitant to bring children into because the church has developed a bit of a bad reputation around protecting children. And people seem to be ready and eager to step up into building a movement with other people of faith and actually becoming leaders in protecting kids from sexual harm. This is a calling for people of faith. And this graphic you see on the screen You'll see more of those throughout our session today. When we had our Safe Church convening last spring or this past spring, where we wanted to see if we could measure culture shift, we had a graphic recording artist. And as stories emerged at the different tables, she visually took the stories and sketched them out on big murals on the wall. And this was one of the things that emerged from a group of tables, that this is a calling. We are God's hands and feet on earth. It is up to us to do this work. And so Samaritan Safe Church, then, our role is to encourage a faith-based social movement stream to protect children from sexual abuse within the river of that bigger social movement. We are part of a movement. We are a growing and vibrant stream, but we are not the movement ourselves. We are part of that river, and our stream is feeding that river. So Samaritan Safe Church, then, our design is to work deeply with congregations to shift culture from denial or apathy about child sexual abuse, denial, it can't happen here, not to people in our congregation, or apathy, it's too complicated an issue, we can't do anything, to proactive engagement in the church and community, creating safe places to keep children safe from sexual and other forms of abuse. In our programs, we do cover all of the different forms of abuse, but we focus primarily on sexual abuse. And one of the reasons it is the most difficult kind of abuse to deal with in a church setting, there's a lot of shame in talking about this for many people. People are uncomfortable when we begin to talk about the sexual violation of children. And we know that children who are sexually abused, particularly when they've been raised in the faith, feel a deep sense of abandonment by God. There is a deep spiritual violation. I have heard children say, I don't think God loves me anymore. And it's heartbreaking because we teach our kids that God is there for them, that God loves them. And when these children are violated, and often they're violated by somebody in their circle of family and friends, their voices cry out to God. And I know that God hears their voices, but we in the church haven't been very good at hearing their voices. And we need to change that. Children don't necessarily come up to us as adults and say, can you help me? I'm being sexually abused. They tell us in ways that they're acting. They tell us in things that they're not saying. And we need to learn to recognize those nonverbal voices. And so we try to teach that to everyone in our congregations, in our Safe Church programs. And as uncomfortable as it may make us to focus on this, we need to talk about it. Because what we don't know as adults can hurt that precious child. And one of the most difficult things in this work, of course, is that stranger danger is not the main problem, Probably 85 to 90% of child sexual abuse happens within the safe world of the child. Where we want our kids to be the safest is where they are in fact at most risk for sexual violation. School, sports, scouts, church, home, community. That is where kids are most at risk. And of course, with statistics of 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys being sexually abused by the age of 18, we need to take a hard look at our congregations and understand 25% of our girls, 20% of our boys are at significant risk for this. And we don't hesitate to teach them about how to stay safe. For example, what caring adult lets a little child cross a street without carefully teaching that child to look both ways, to take great care? And we certainly don't go throwing a kid in deep water without teaching him how to swim, and yet we seem to be perfectly content to let our children go out into the world without ever teaching them safety about child sexual abuse. So we need to be able to talk about this in church, not only to other adults, but to our children. And it is difficult. However, you also should know that the research on girls in particular shows girls who are sexually abused are almost 5 times more likely to be raped later in life as teens or young women. Many of the sexual assault cases I've dealt with on college campuses, the victim was sexually abused as a child and had a really difficult time standing up for herself or being able to be forceful in saying, no, I don't want this. Girls who are sexually abused are also more likely to be involved with a violent partner in their teens or in their adult years. You know, one of my good friends that works at the domestic violence shelter here in Lancaster has said many times that if there's one thing that battered women who come through our doors have in common, it's that most of them were sexually abused as children. It leaves a girl so vulnerable to abuse later in life, sexual, domestic, and many other ways. There are so many signs of sexual abuse, and I've just put up here some of the most common ones. And in kids that have been sexually abused, we may see one or two or three of these signs. Certainly any one or even a couple doesn't mean there's sexual abuse, but it certainly means enough that we need to be asking some questions in skillful ways of that child. We see kids with a lot of nightmares and sleeping problems. Regressive behavior. A child is potty trained and suddenly that child isn't potty trained anymore and we can't figure it out. We had one heartbreaking case where a child who was still in diapers and was a really happy, really kind of calm little girl began to fight her mom furiously whenever her mom would change her diaper. She seemed terrified. And then she began acting out with some of her toys in ways that were extremely disturbing. And it took a couple of months to unpack it because this child was just beginning to be verbal. She couldn't talk much. But that baby was being sexually molested at the nursery in her church. And not only molested, she and some others were being filmed for pornographic purposes. This was at a church that had a child protection policy, background checks, and some training, and they thought they had it covered. And as I'll talk later, you so don't have it covered if you just kind of have those check the box things in place. We may see a child that doesn't want to be around a certain person anymore, doesn't want to go to another family's house. We might see a kid that spaces out a lot. And when it's severe, we call this dissociation. Now, we've all kind of spaced out probably while we're driving a car. I mean, certainly I have been driving down the road and it's like I blink my eyes and I've gone 3 miles and I really don't remember it. That's pretty common. Dissociation is a much more extreme form. And what that means is that when a child is repeatedly sexually abused, and many times this isn't a once-off kind of event because it happens in the context of the intimate circles a child is in. It often goes for a period of months or years. And when that child learns that there is nothing he or she can do to get away, because often this is an adult or an older child or teen that he or she cares about, respects. That child has a defense mechanism that includes a shutdown process, and that mechanism involves neurochemicals in the brain. So instead of having your brain flooded with neurochemicals that would enable you to run or to fight back, adrenaline, for example, these kids' bodies begin to change so that they are flooded with chemicals when they are threatened that are more like analgesics, more to numb the pain, to help them mentally kind of get away from what is happening, to not feel. You'll hear many survivors talk about feeling like they were outside of their body looking down while it was happening, not able to feel what was happening. Well, once that neurobiological dissociative mechanism becomes embedded in a child over time, it isn't limited to just the times of abuse. Instead, a child is sitting in school and she's in third grade and she's stressed because the teacher is criticizing some aspect of her homework. Her neurobiology at the first sign of stress or threat kicks into dissociation. She checks out. She doesn't hear it anymore. She can't process it. So that checking out, that dissociation often follows children then into adulthood. So we have adults who are in their 30s and 40s. When they are stressed or when they are under pressure, their bodies have a reaction that says, oh, I'm out of here, can't deal with this, and they mentally leave. And some lose chunks of memory and chunks of time. We'll see children sometimes withdrawing, or in the other spectrum, becoming aggressive if they've been abused. See a lot of psychosomatic complaints. Sexual abuse takes place in the body. So the body aches. My stomach hurts, I can't go to school, my arm hurts, my head hurts, constant. And as these kids grow up, we see often women and men moving through different departments in the hospital setting. I used to teach in a hospital setting for a number of years, and we were teaching physicians and nurses to recognize when somebody is moving from department to department. You can never find what the etiology is. Start looking. Start asking some questions about trauma in their childhood, because it isn't over when it's over. For many people, it just keeps on going. Sometimes kids will have injuries to their private parts, but that is primarily if there's been penetration. There's a lot of sexual abuse. Doesn't involve penetration. And then if there has been, that child may have trouble sitting or walking. We see a lot of frequent sore throats with these kids. And that's because there's a significant amount of forced oral sex with these children, and often that leaves no medical discernible injury or sign at all. Teens, we see it start to ramp up into self-harming behaviors, cutting themselves, burning. Certainly not every teen who self-harms has been abused, but teens who have been sexually abused or are being abused are at higher risk for this behavior, and there is good reason for it. Some kids will tell you, I cut so I can feel something. I'm so numb, because sexual abuse can make you numb. You don't feel anything. Others will say, I cut so I see myself bleed. At least I know I'm alive. So there are logical reasons for people that are doing this self-harming behavior, which shocks and disturbs many of us who don't know much about the impact of trauma. We'll see teens using drugs or alcohol to cope. We'll see a significant amount of eating disorders, depression, anxiety. Attempted suicide rates are far higher among children and teens who've been sexually abused. So there's a cascade of symptoms that keeps on, which is why I always encourage people, if you even suspect that a child has been sexually harmed, and you have the notion, well, the perpetrator's moved away, maybe he's okay now, understand it is not over when it's over. The sooner that that child can be questioned and there can be a discovery of what may have happened, and it might be another kind of trauma. The sooner that child can heal, it is far there is a far more favorable prognosis for healing when there is good intervention early in life rather than decades later. However, there is also, and this in faith communities is something that we really need to take seriously, there is a huge impact on faith. Maya Angelou, the beloved poet and Nobel laureate and writer, who was herself sexually abused as a child, said once that sexual abuse can take a child who knows nothing and turn her into a child who believes nothing. That is the impact, the potential impact of sexual violation in childhood. And if we in the church are going to think we can leave it to counselors and detectives and social workers to fix this, we are abdicating our responsibility. We in the church need to know how to tend these deep emotional and spiritual wounds for children and for adults. And the spiritual wounds are many. You know, I have talked to so many survivors that even at 50 or 60 years old still feel a deep sense of abandonment by God. You know, survivors often feel pressured to forgive and they just can't forgive. And they've heard from the church all of their lives that they need to forgive and they feel guilty. And when I suggest to them that perhaps you can leave it to God to forgive if you can't, and your job is to heal, sometimes there is like a tremendous burden is just lifted off of them. Some survivors feel the abuse is punishment in some way, that they were bad, they were wrong, they let it happen. Others hold an unhealthy belief that God wants him or her, the victim, to suffer. Many survivors hold a huge amount of anger at God. And we say that it is okay. God can hear your anger. We only need to look at our sacred text, at the laments, to know that we are standing firmly in biblical tradition, to be angry with God for that lack of protection. You know, where was God when I was raped? Is an unanswerable question that I have heard so many times. And we need to be able to sit with those questions and allow the voicing of them. Many survivors do feel extreme shame, feel like they really carry the burden that rightfully belongs to the offender. They feel like I am a bad person. And then, of course, the heartbreak is that so many just stop believing in God. So many. We need to change this. One of the things that I love about Safe Church is after we work with a church in a one-year process of having a sustained conversation about child sexual abuse, and they begin to shift their culture, survivors come to us and want to know, where are those safe churches that perhaps they can kind of test out to see if it's a place for them after they have abandoned the church for so many years. And then, of course, these adult survivors continue to suffer not only the spiritual wounds, but the emotional and the physical impact. There's a lot of chronic pain, the eating disorders, the nightmares, depression, anxiety, suicide, difficulty in intimate relationships, having trust even for the people you love most, post-traumatic stress disorder. Many people don't know that statistically, you are far more likely to be diagnosed with clinical post-traumatic stress disorder if you are a victim of sexual violence than you are if you're a soldier in combat. That is how devastating and traumatic this is. And then, of course, many adult survivors continue on with self-harming behaviors. So, the traditional approach to child protection in a church setting has been we're going to maintain kind of what we call the status quo. We're going to have what I call a dry bones policy. And we might get this courtesy of an insurance company or maybe our denomination, or maybe we pull it from a website. We're going to do a couple of hours of training for staff and volunteers every year, maybe an hour or two, and we're going to do background checks, and we've got it covered. So that's been the traditional approach. And when I first came to Samaritan and I worked at bringing up, and this is maybe 15 years ago that I've been at, I first came to Samaritan after my corporate career. And I worked at bringing up a sexual and domestic violence prevention program. I began doing a lot of consulting, particularly in church settings. And over time, I developed a reputation as a consultant who could work with parishes and congregations when the sexual violation of a child had occurred. Often it was at the hands of a trusted leader, ordained or non-ordained, and the whole congregation was traumatized and split over what had happened. And as I did that work, I became so painfully aware that the Christian church, just as an institution, I'm not talking about any particular denomination, they have historically privileged protection and inclusion of offenders and the comfort of bystanders, using doctrines of forgiveness over healing and justice for survivors and protection of children. And traditionally, churches have also used language that minimizes and denies the damage done by sexual violence. And our church culture often discourages survivors from seeking healing or sharing their stories out loud, having open conversations about child sexual abuse. And yet, we know that 95% of offenders describe themselves as extremely religious in studies, and they gravitate toward congregations, molesting children and often being forgiven quickly by church leaders that try to protect offenders from the legal or the moral consequences of their actions, and also try to protect their institutions from liability or reputational damage. And this was the status quo, this dry bones policy, staff and volunteer training, background checks that I saw among the churches where these horrific cases of child sexual abuse were occurring. And I think it was in 2009 that I worked on a really big case. It was our biggest case ever, where multiple victims and 2 offenders were identified within a single congregation. And these victims were all men who had been molested as boys by 2 different offenders. And the ripple effects created enormous losses. And one of the survivors had taken his own life. And lawyers and judicatory leaders were involved. And my interviews with survivors, because when I worked as a consultant, I always made it clear I would be guided and led by what survivors wanted. So I interviewed as many survivors as we could find. I interviewed the parents of the young man who had taken his life, which was one of the hardest interviews I had ever done, because the offender had been good friends with the parents and had offenders actually befriend the parents of victims they want to target. So the survivors that I interviewed, these parents, they all say, we need to change the culture in these churches. We need to change the way people think about child sexual abuse. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again. And that's a goal that can't be achieved by maintaining the status quo. It was heartbreaking to do this kind of consulting work. And after this case, I worked for almost 2 years with that church. And I didn't want to focus my energy anymore on helping to heal the wounds after the fact. And that's when I became really determined to try to do something to prevent the sexual violation of children from happening. And it was about that time that we got invited to submit a proposal to Ms. Foundation, and Safe Church was created. You know, this traditional approach to child protection also often has a lot to do with compliance with the law, you know, the focus on mandated reporting. And that's important and it's good. You know, in Pennsylvania, we had an avalanche of legislative change after the Jerry Sandusky scandal a couple of years back. And my program administrator, Diane, is an attorney by profession, although she isn't practicing right now. And I was so grateful because we spent the full year of 2014 with our desks just covered with stacks of legislation trying to translate this complexity into our policies that our churches could understand. And we take compliance seriously. You know, our policies are considered some of the best in PA. And we've even been asked by a couple of insurance agencies if we would sell them to the insurance agencies so they could give them to their clients, and we refuse to do that. We just won't distribute policies apart from the process of a church becoming a safe church and interacting with that policy. Our policies are designed to be interactive, and teams work with us over a full year together with other teams in a cluster to create that policy. The process itself is so important.
As you're probably getting by this time, we are not a quick fix. We are just not a quick fix. We tell people if that's what you want, then we're not the program that you want to work with. Because we know pictures don't tell the story in our congregation. They do not tell the story. When we look out over our congregation, we can't tell that a number of people are carrying invisible wounds from childhood sexual abuse. We can't tell that there probably is someone among us who has offended against a child and has never been discovered. We can't tell that that little girl or that little boy is being violated by a teacher or a coach or maybe even a dad. And so the pictures do not tell the story. And too often, it's because there is a willful blindness in our congregations. We don't want to see what's really there. We like that nice photogenic kind of picture. We don't want to see. So our work then, if we're really going to shift culture into congregations, is to really challenge people. What would it look like with eyes wide open? What about opening our eyes to seeing what is actually going on in our church and in our community? So eyes wide open is the stance that we want to take. One of the frameworks that we use for Safe Church, as well as movement building, is that it is a missional program. If we work with a church and all they do is create safety within their congregation, then we have failed. We have failed. We want that. That's important. And we want to work in a way that equips and inspires people to move it out into the community, to work with other organizations, or to share what they've learned with other churches so other churches can become safer, but we have a very missional framework. So our approach then is to really raise those dry bones, especially the churches that think they've got it covered. And we want to engage the entire congregation. You know, sometimes if I'm speaking on a Sunday morning, I will ask people, raise your hands if you've got a child out there somewhere you love and want that child to stay safe from sexual harm. It might be a grandson, a granddaughter, a niece, a nephew, a neighbor kid. Raise your hands, and almost all of the hands will go up. I say, well, this is for you. This is for you. We want to shift the culture so that it's very clear that adults have the responsibility for keeping kids safe. We're going to teach kids healthy boundaries, but the responsibility lies on the adults. And we're going to build the supportive infrastructure to sustain those changes. Anybody know what this is? It's Grand Central Station in New York City. It's a beautiful building, really, but it's not a destination for the most part. It's a hub, right? It's where we come into to connect with trains that are going out of there to other places. Well, that's what we want churches that are participating with us to be like. We want them to be hubs so that people are educated and equipped and inspired in the church, but that doesn't stay there. It goes out into their community. We have long found it, or we actually found it from the beginning, rather. Our project in this vision from Isaiah. And in the 60th chapter of Isaiah, it's written, "No longer will violence be heard in your land, nor ruin and destruction within your borders. You will call your walls salvation and your gates praise." Now that's a vision of safety for communities, for churches, for our nation that I think almost all people of Christian faith could agree on. We want to hold that vision of nonviolence and peace. But in our experience, you don't get to claim a vision because it sounds good. You have to really work to live into that vision until you can dare begin to claim it. And we tell congregations coming into the one-year program, this is going to be hard work. You're going to spend a lot of hours. It's going to probably bring up stuff for a lot of people. And after 1 year, you'll just be at the beginning of being able to claim that vision, because it is hard work to do this. So we take ecumenical groups of churches, we call them clusters, maybe 6 to 10 churches together, through a 1-year process of learning about child sexual abuse so that we're equipping adults to prevent it. And we find that, no matter what our theological orientation is, almost all of us can agree that the sexual abuse of a child is a great sin. And as Christians, we are called by God to do everything in our power to prevent this from happening. Our teams form the cluster, and each church that participates sends a team to 6 cluster meetings over the course of the year. The teams work together. We have an interactive policy template that's color-coded. We'll say, this is legal stuff. Don't care if you hate it. Don't mess with it. We'll say, this is what you signed on when you covenant with us to be part of this process, which might include, for example, a 2-adult rule for taking care of children, or might include, for example, our policies include how you will safely welcome a known sexual offender with strict boundary provisions. So the teams do the interactive policy and deep learning on child sexual abuse and adult survivors and how to work with them. And the teams are the liaisons to their congregations, kind of communicating out what's happening during the meetings and constantly feeding them worship and other resources that we're providing. And one of the beautiful things about doing this in a cluster like this, teams with other churches, you form a learning community together. And, we're constantly asking the people in the team, so what are you discovering about yourself and your congregation as you move through this work? What are the faith issues that are being raised for you? Why do you think there's such reluctance to talk about this in churches? And when you have a number of churches together, teams discover that the same dynamics that exist in their church often are existing in other churches. And they begin to resource each other and think together about how to overcome some challenges and how to support each other when things don't go well, because there's always resistance to this work. And we have components in the program, certainly the strongest component is the core team meetings running throughout the year. But we also go into each congregation twice during that year to do direct education to the whole congregation. First on adult survivors who are suffering and being silent, and secondly then on the grooming process often used by sexual offenders to engage kids and why kids don't tell, so we do that. We do an honoring of adult survivors throughout the program. We actually want churches to understand that, number one, they have an obligation to create safe space for survivors, and survivors who have healed and want to do so are enormous sources of wisdom for leadership in this work. And we'll talk at the workshop more about how we develop survivors as leaders. We have a one-day retreat as part of the program called Tamar Speaks. Last year, it was this year, we had a woman fly up from North Carolina to come to the retreat because there are so few retreats now that are faith integrated for survivors. We use resources, worship resources for awareness, curriculums for children and teens, and then there is a half-a-day training when churches come into the process for staff and volunteers. And when people say, how do I know if I have a safe church? We would say there's really three core aspects. I will say, is child sexual abuse prevention and response integrated as a theological commitment and community covenant? Because a lot of the work we do with congregations up front is helping them frame, based on their understanding of scriptures and their own congregation's mission and identity, why are we doing this work? What is our theological and scriptural ground? We make them figure that out for themselves and write statements about it. So is it integrated into your very identity? This is who we are as people. We protect the most vulnerable among us. A safe church continually educates parents, children, and other congregants to prevent sexual abuse in the broader safe world of the child, not simply in the congregation. And a safe church lifts up and empowers adult survivors to become leaders. Those are the core elements that we see as comprising a truly safe church. We engage survivors in various ways. One is through our retreat, and I'll talk more about that in the workshop. And we're also doing something called wisdom circles, where we bring 4 to 8 survivors into a circle and ask them from their own wisdom, from their experience, what is your response to 2 or 3 critical questions that will inform our work so we can do better, and that we can also share collectively with this bigger secular movement with which we are working. We might ask our survivors, for example, how do you feel about transparency for offenders when they're coming into your church? Does the congregation have a right to know that offender is present? And we want to hear what they have to say about that. We might ask them questions like, who or what has most supported you in your healing journey? What did they do? What didn't they do? So we'll talk more about that later on in the workshop, but we try to engage survivors in different ways. But we really want to honor in everything we do the wisdom that they have from their own experience. Education is often on a Sunday morning, and it's a little shocking sometimes, especially for some congregants, to have a Sunday morning focus on child sexual abuse. But the way we work with it is very theologically and spiritually integrated. So we use scriptures to really frame what we're talking about. And it's a rare education session that we have where we don't have disclosures afterwards from adult survivors who are so grateful that this is finally being talked about openly. I think you may be using Circle of Grace in some of your churches. We use a Circle of Grace curriculum for kids, which is really a broad, healthy boundary curriculum, teaches kids how to protect that circle of love that they live within, and how to notice at age-appropriate levels is something unsafe or something they're not sure about is coming into that circle of grace. So the healthy boundary curriculums, and we don't help churches do those until they've gone through the whole program, because I do not want kids being given a curriculum where they are likely to make disclosures and people are not equipped to handle it. So we say first we go through the whole program. The final piece is then you start to implement these curriculums. We want to make sure adults know it is their responsibility. It is not on the kids. Yep, we're going to teach them, but as adults, we all have responsibility. So in our local region then, in our 5 years of work, we've worked with more than 50 local congregations now for a full-year program. And that impacts about 11,000 adults and a little over 7,000 children. We've trained Mennonite and Lutheran leaders in our areas to facilitate, and so they're also running additional local clusters. And what happens then is you have a geographic region that is saturated with churches from different traditions that have a common ground on how they're going to go about protecting children, with the goal of having the surrounding communities become safer because of the missional aspect of it. So our big vision, though, then, is to have multiple clusters of safe churches in relationship with local organizations working to end child sexual abuse within communities across the country, because we can't possibly facilitate in other places because of the intensity of the process and the length of time. And so a couple of years ago then, we developed a facilitator training, which Bonnie came to down in Atlanta a couple of years back, a very intense 3-day training to equip leaders to do this in their communities. And we've trained at this point, I guess, about 125 facilitators across the country. And our next one, I did one in Houston this past summer, and I'm going to go to Sacramento early next year. So it's spread pretty broad, but we're just finding people of faith are ready for this. They are just ready to step up into something bigger. And the facilitators learn how to run this process in a group of congregations. And they are agents of cultural change, and we want to inspire and equip them in 3 short days to be leaders in this movement to end child sexual abuse. So one of the things we're doing later, next year, it will be in the fall of next year, is we're going to hold a small convening and invite some of the facilitators that are doing this work to come together and talk. How's it look in Texas versus how's it looking in Virginia versus how's it looking in Lancaster, and what are our challenges? We use what we call a narrative leadership framework in our training, because leadership really matters. Leadership really matters in this work. And in the leadership cohort that I became part of back in 2011, working with Ms. Foundation and these other organizations, we looked at models of movement building that included storytelling as leadership practice. And the work of Marshall Gantz from the Harvard Kennedy School on why stories matter. Public narrative, collective action, and power really resonated with us. He organized social movements back in the days of civil rights, and he's just an amazing individual. And his questions that he talks about in building a movement are the same ones that we were struggling with in those early days. And it was like, how do we motivate people to challenge the status quo? Sometimes the status quo is kind of comfortable. It's not good, we'll admit that, but it's not bad enough that we want to really upset it. But how do we get people to challenge that? And how do we get people to move from compliance, well, we just have to accept this, to really insisting that we make changes? So Gantz holds that organized collective action doesn't just happen because there's resources in place or because we have big cases and there's an occasional burst of, oh my gosh, we have to do something. He says that the capacity of a social movement depends largely on the depth and the breadth and the quality of its leaders who are able to turn opportunity to purpose. And that is because the facts and the stats and the research and all of that, they're good, but they're not enough. So public narrative in Gantz's work is a practice where leaders translate values into actions. Because we experience our values as emotions. And if we can tap into people's core values, we are far more likely to get them to move to action to make change than if we remain in the realm of the head, citing facts and stats and research, right? And if we learn to tell compelling stories as leaders, stories are how we learn things. Stories are how we teach our kids, how we understand our experiences, how to act. Stories communicate through the language of the heart. They communicate our values. So when we are told a compelling story, we get the moral of it as well as just the intellectual content of it. And so a narrative leadership framework integrates the head, the strategy, the actions, the hands, and the emotions, the heart. So we bring those three things together when we use storytelling to mobilize social change. And in Gantz's work, there are three stories here. There's a story of self. Why am I called to do this work as a leader? We all have a story, and as leaders, we need to be able to talk about why this work is important to us. Why am I called? The second is the story of us, okay? Who are the people I'm called to do this work with? What is our story? This is the relational, okay? Becoming an us. And the third is the story of now. That's the story of realizing that the world and the world of our churches is not as it ought to be. And there's a tension between how it ought to be and how we're actually living it out. And that's a value tension. And if we're able to make that clear and help people stand in that very uncomfortable gap between who we say we are as a people and the values we hold and what we're actually doing, by telling the story of now, the urgency of taking action, the nexus of these three stories is where we can begin to mobilize people to change. Now, as people of faith, we have a bigger framing story, okay? We have our Holy Scriptures. We have the stories in the Bible in which we can frame our work and organize around. So we add another component to Gantz's work when we do it in churches, and that is the bigger framing story on who God calls us to be as communities of Christians, as community believers. And in narrative leadership, we teach people to answer those why questions. Why me? Who or what is calling me? Why these people? Why these congregations? Who am I called to work with? Why here? Why now? Why in this place? What is so urgent? There's 10 million other things that I could focus on. Why this work? So narrative leadership forces you to work on the deeper whys. These are not new questions, by the way. These are the same questions that Moses had when God called him to liberate his people. And in many ways, we are being called to liberate people from the chains that bind them to abuse and to doing harm. Moses had these very same questions. Why me, God? There's so many other people who'd be better at this than me. Why me? Who are you? Who is calling me? What are you calling me? Why do you want me to free these people? Why here? Why now? Why in this place? These are prophetic questions. And so the story of now articulates an urgent challenge. It requires we make a choice. That's important. We have to choose. It involves a hopeful vision. We can't just let people in that painful and uncomfortable gap of not doing what we're called to do. We have to give them a vision to work towards. And we have to embed that in a greater vision, God's vision, for who we are as church. And Martin Luther King, in fact, coined the phrase, the fierce urgency of now, at a sermon he delivered at Riverside Church, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And Dr. King said, we are faced now with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In the unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. For that little boy who's being abused at this moment by someone he trusts, we're already too late. For that little girl who's going to be violated tonight by her brother, we are too late. So there is an urgency because child sexual abuse is so prevalent. The Centers for Disease Control now calls it a public health epidemic. And the status quo, where we don't do anything to change the conditions that allow 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys to be violated, is not okay with God. It is not okay. Who will do it if we don't raise our voice? We have God on our side, is what people in our churches told us at convening. And this culture shift is what we were really interested in looking at. This is a little bit more of our deep dive into what this means when we did our convening. And culture is pretty invisible, kind of like, fish swimming in the ocean can't really describe the ocean as you're swimming in it. Or, probably nobody taught you the rules of an elevator, Like, we kind of know when we get into an elevator, if there's one other person in there, we don't go and stand right up beside that other person. They would probably give us a side eye and move away. We know that generally if we're in an elevator, we're going to face front, we're going to space ourselves out if there's room. Those things don't get explicitly taught to us. We absorb them by watching other people. So culture is mostly invisible to those who are within it. And once we're part of it, we often don't stop to think about why it is we act in a certain way or why we use a particular language to express ourselves in a given setting. Every church has its own unique culture. A workplace has its culture. Your family has its culture. And that culture shapes your identity. Culture includes a set of key ideas, a way of expressing things, a set of values or norms, and a system of rewards and penalties that can be very direct or indirect and subtle. Okay? So culture is shared patterns of interaction and behavior that are learned through a process of socialization and they give identity to the group. So when we talk about shifting culture in a congregation, we're messing with some deep stuff because we're starting to shift identity in that congregation. So group norms of behavior, the underlying shared values, customs, traditions, and narratives that keep those norms in place is how we define church culture. And those norms exist within a container, a structure of policies and practices, including there's going to be some legislative, for example, mandated reporting of suspected child abuse and regulatory frames in that container. Culture shifts to be effective have got to come from within the culture itself. Nobody is going to come into a church and tell it it's got to change. It has to come from within us. We need to surface the elephant in the room, the thing that nobody wants to talk about. We need to use the values and the language and the key ideas of the culture we want to change. We need to work in a way that allows us gradually to challenge the norms that are incongruent with the stated identity and values of the culture. It also takes a long time. This is not fast or quick work. And culture shifts aren't easy to measure, but they can be detective by changes in the cultural narrative, the way people talk about themselves. Because one thing that we can affirm, because we have seen it time and again, culture eats strategy for breakfast. The famous business person first gave us that phrase. It doesn't matter if you have the greatest strategy in the world. If you try to run that strategy in a culture that is not suited for that strategy just simply will not work. People may seem to embrace it for a short period of time, but it'll reset to the norm that it had before you ever started that work. You have got to pay attention to the culture. You need to be able to sequence the changes when you're doing culture shift work. Our program is very sequenced to bring people on board in ways that can be tolerated and gradually ramped up. We do know, for example, if you do some kinds of educational sessions or other events that are not grounded in a sequence model of change, it can increase resistance. You can lose people because you've given them too much too soon. They're not ready. If you sequence the change work carefully, you get increased trust. You can get unintended consequences if you're not careful with this. One example would be a church who successfully participated in our very first cluster back in 2011, but the pastors were very nervous about coming in because more than 20 years ago, the pastors, and these are long-term pastors, they had been in this same church back then, they really wanted the congregation to understand more about childhood sexual abuse and the implications because they knew there were survivors. So these were visionary leaders ahead of their time. So they had a young woman from the community come in one Sunday morning and do a worship drama. It was a dramatization of incest and her father coming to her bed. And they said it just blew up the congregation. People were upset. They weren't ready for it. They said we had to put it back in the box, and spend a lot of time having to do repair work because they weren't ready. So they came into Safe Church with some nervousness, but because of the sequencing of the work and the way we approach it, now their churches is one of the most shining examples of churches that have really integrated this work because they were ready. Another example I can give you is our Tamar Speaks retreat. The very first time we ran a cluster, we scheduled the retreat for about 4 months into the process, and our clusters run close to a full year. And, we had this great retreat and facilitator, and nobody was signing up. We had 3 people signed up. What's wrong? We know there are survivors. Why aren't they coming? And so we had to cancel it. And what we learned is we found out as we continued the work, survivors didn't trust that this was any more than a flash in the pan for their congregation. They had been there before. They had big events or things happen and then everything goes back to usual. Nothing ever changes. They did not trust their congregations are really committed to making a change. So we ended up rescheduling that retreat for close to the end of the year, and we had 30 survivors come. So that told us in this process, now we always schedule the retreats later on in the process. So changing culture then requires simultaneous work on the relational web of norms and values within the congregation as well as the surrounding container. And our work is designed to shift culture in 5 categories or 5 buckets. And, as I mentioned earlier, when our year's worth of work finishes, that cultural shift is just starting to happen because it takes a long time. There are no shortcuts for this work, not if you're going to do deep work that has a lasting impact. And so the buckets of change that we designed our work are first increasing awareness and more open discussion about child sexual abuse, breaking the silence. The second is creating environments where adult survivors feel safe and supported. The third is creating environments for children and youth, ensuring they have trusted adults established in the congregation they can go to with concerns about something that's happening at school, at home, or even in the church. The fourth is making the infrastructure changes related to policy, practice, and facilities. And the fifth is developing CSA-related ministries and or sharing their learning with others, going missional. That's the fifth. So one of the questions we had to ask then after 5 years of work, how do we know it's working? How do we know this culture change that we just start to catalyze in a year continues after we finish with this group of churches? Like, how do we know? So that was one of the reasons that we decided to hold a convening this past April. And we worked with a cultural shift evaluator. There are such people, believe it or not. She came in from Washington, D.C., to help us design a system of data collection by surveys prior to the convening to help us quantitatively measure shifts within these buckets for churches that had gone through the program as long as 5 years ago, who we hadn't worked with a whole lot since then. And also then design the day of convening to allow space for stories to emerge that could illustrate whether or not these shifts were happening. And I have to admit, it was a little scary because you invest all this in your work and okay, what if I find out it's not working, But we have to be willing to we have to test ourselves. And then we have to realize if we find something's not working, we need to make changes to our work, And so our purpose for the day of the convening, and these were leaders from all of the churches we've worked with, was to share stories of hope and challenge and success, to learn how churches are changing as a result of Safe Church, to understand what we need to do more of to deepen the work with these churches to keep children safe, and also to create a space for connections for social movement building and faith communities, because each congregation gets to know the other 4 to 9 congregations in a cluster, but the clusters don't really get to know each other. So this was our first event where we brought people from the many churches over 5 years together. And so we did our documentation and research, and we did survivor interviews, and we had our consultant, and we had our wonderful graphic recorder to record in graphic form what was emerging during the day. And that's just one of the many, many panels that she drew for us.
And you might recognize if I'm looking at this screen on the lower left-hand side, see the Encourage a Faith-Based Stream graphic that we pulled out. We have interviews with survivors up there. We have, over on the right-hand side, we had a musician who is a gifted and talented man. His child was sexually abused, and he's written a song for her and all the other children who have been sexually abused, and performs this in churches and other settings. And I have heard the song so many times, and I cannot hear it without weeping. It is so moving. And it's called When a Sparrow Calls. So we had lots of stuff going on during the day. And we articulated, our big goal is to shift the culture from denial or apathy about child sexual abuse. And what we discovered as we called through all of the data that we gathered and put it together quantitatively, and then looked at the stories, that culture change is actually happening in churches. Different paces for different churches, but we were very excited to see movement in each of these buckets. So these are just some of the things. We have reams of data, and these are just a few highlights of when we asked, as a result of Safe Church, are people in your congregation talking more openly about CSA? So we did that quantitatively, scale to 1 to 10 on the data, and then we asked, for stories at the convening. And people said yes, that people in the congregation are more aware and they're more comfortable in talking about child sexual abuse. We have open discussions about it at our committee meetings, our adult Sunday class, our activity planning. It's part of what we talk about. Parents contact leadership if they see signs of abuse in their child or they're worried about something in the church. We finally have resolution on welcoming known sexual offenders and protection of the congregation, especially survivors of violence. When you bring an offender in, you have to remember there's a lot of survivors in the congregation who are going to be triggered by that, and it takes a lot of work to do this well. People said we've had several sermons on CSA, we've had some sharing of stories, testimonies by adult survivors. So that was the first bucket. Are people talking more? The second was, are you creating safe environments for adult survivors? Are you supporting them? And this was our bucket that was still, we did less well in this than in the safe environments for children. And so one of the things that told us is we really have to increase our efforts for adult survivors. This was seen as a little bit harder, but still there was good progress. Say that survivors are seeking and receiving good support from pastoral staff, that we have a more open and supportive environment. Survivors are starting to have more confidence that they can share their stories with people in the congregation. What really excites me is the churches that say survivors have become leaders in Safe Church, and that's contributing to their healing journey. And we also heard people say the more visible we have it in the congregation, announcements, newsletter, advertised retreats, the more signals to survivors that the environment is safe. So we heard that is happening in churches. Sharing of stories is really important because for the most part in many churches, survivors do not feel safe enough to share their story, either with the whole congregation, which certainly not everybody would want to do, or even to get help or support from a small group of people that can walk with them in times of stress or when they have to go through healing. Because healing isn't linear. If you're a survivor of a lot of trauma, you may do a lot of healing, but there may be something that triggers you, quite frankly, this election cycle. Because of some of the talk about sexual violence has been enormously triggering for many survivors, and they've needed a lot of extra support. So we want to have people trained, at least a small group of lay people in each church that know how to give that support. One of the things we heard
at the table, that they so ground this in Jesus, and that one of the refrains from the piece of music that this dad of the sexually abused child does is, Jesus knows your pain, you can bring it to Jesus. And so one of the things we heard emerging from a table is we have eyes that are open and we can stop abuse. We are called to protect the vulnerable. So I thought that was really beautiful and an illustration. So she's sketching away while people are sharing this stuff. We did really well on safe environments. That was our highest score of all of the buckets. They say it has changed so dramatically for our kids that teachers and volunteers actually get it. Why this is important rather than just following a policy. They've been trained and they're really working to build trusting relationships with these kids and with youth. They say there's a lot of fellowship and other activities that are working on better communication about boundaries and healthy sexuality between youth and adults in the larger congregation. They also say the Circle of Grace curriculum opens the door to having conversations, and that children are now, after a couple of years of this, talking about their Circle of Grace. They're using that language. And they say we are getting disclosures from our kids as a result of having trusting adults. Now that can be challenging disclosure, not just responding to the child, but if the person who's alleged to have harmed them is somebody in the congregation or their family, you have to be prepared to step into a very difficult time with that. So one of the stories we heard from the table is, disclosure from a little boy, who told a trusted adult, my stepdad touches me, And they said, if it hadn't been for our work in this, he wouldn't have been able to come to a trusted adult and say that. He wouldn't have had a framework or language for it. Another shared a story of feeling really worried. A member felt really worried because a man was often offering to take children, the boys, to the restroom if they need it. And so that table, one of the things that we're alert and aware because of Safe Church. And when this guy said, I'll take your boy to the restroom, people, no, that's not going to happen. So people are talking about different things that they're seeing, disclosures. And because we do teach about grooming behavior and what to notice, and that adults need to step up and say something if they're concerned, you may be wrong, and that's okay. And you don't want to accuse somebody. I think you're sexually grooming that kid, but if you start to notice that somebody is paying too much attention to a kid in a way that your gut says maybe this isn't good, there are ways to intervene with that. And let the adult know, for example, there's so many things to say about that. But if, for example, an adult is in the habit, or you hear an adult tell an off-color joke when there are young teens around, you as an adult have the power to step up and say, that is really inappropriate. We've got young people here. I really don't want you to do that anymore. Kids can't do that. You as an adult can do it. It's going to make you uncomfortable. That person may be mad at you, but that's okay. We are the adults in the room. We have to be able to do that kind of stuff. So when we looked at what kind of activities did you initiate, because our bucket is missional, what did you do? Some churches started support groups for survivors from the community, so they're running support groups. Others are going to many trainings on the topic now. They are training all of their volunteers and offering the same training to the whole congregation, holding an adult forum with a speaker from a rape crisis center. We heard a couple say that. They're holding child abuse awareness campaigns. So they're really engaging the community, though, as well, and they describe it as a partnership of the church and the community that they're situated in. And as churches are sharing their learning, we heard many ways. Some of them are going on to provide safe church training for their synod, or they're presenting their work or their policies at local conferences and association meetings, and they're sharing information with other congregations. And what we're also hearing is that more and more churches, survivors are coming to the churches that are now identified as safe churches, and checking out churches, because many survivors have been estranged from church for a lot of years. because they don't feel as though their pain is validated, as though people were really supporting them. And one of the things, quite frankly, we heard at the convening was that these churches want more visibility. They're proud. And they should feel a sense of pride in having done this work. And so we developed a bunch of resources now to create more visibility for the churches. So we have logos they can post on their websites. We have certificates. But maybe even more importantly, we developed cards to put on chairs or in pews or in the narthex that stay there permanently or can be taken, but they're cards that identify this as a Samaritan Safe Church. And on one side of the card, it describes what that is. And on the other side of the card, it says very clearly, we strive to create a safe environment for survivors. And this is what we do. We strive to create a safe environment for children. This is what we do. We strive to welcome known sexual offenders. This is what we do. So it's very visible because churches were saying, we could have a survivor come in and we maybe have worship resources on this once a month. What if that survivor comes in and we're not doing it that Sunday? How does he or she know? So we realized that's a really important issue. So we created resource cards to identify them. So it's highly visible in the congregation. So infrastructure, that was another very strong area, that the policies and practices, people know the policies, they're posted on websites, there's copies in the narthexes, but even more importantly, not just staff and volunteers, members understand why this is important. Why? Because of the theological grounding and the deep education, the whole congregation gets that this is part of our covenant on how we live together in Christian community. We take care of the most vulnerable among us, not just in church, but out there in the community. This is who we are. Pennsylvania has a long, complicated process now for even a Sunday school teacher being able to supervise children because of all of the legislation. You have to get certified with 3 different background checks in many cases, including FBI fingerprinting in some cases. So despite all of that, some churches said, we've got increased numbers of approved and certified adults. A lot of them made facility changes. We had the teams do a walkthrough of their facility during one of our early cluster meetings in the year, and we asked them to go through the facility with the eyes of someone that wanted to sexually offend against a child and was looking for a place within the facility to do that. And people, they say it's eye-opening for them to walk through their building with those kind of eyes. It's upsetting in many ways. But when people come back into the cluster meeting, we have them all share and put up on Post-it notes on the wall what they found in their facility that may be unsafe places, big unlocked closets, classrooms with doors that are solid and not kept open for teaching, mentoring programs with very little supervision or accountability in place, cabins where youth meets on the perimeter of the property that are very isolated. When they come back and start sharing with the other teams, we realize that church architecture, especially for the older churches, but even some of the newer, is not designed with protection of children from sexual abuse in mind. It just isn't. And so people begin to go to their property committees and say, look, we discovered these things. Maybe we can't do it this year, but can we put in the budget to do some stuff next year? Or can we at least get locks for these closet doors? So we heard a lot about changes in facilities, everything from hallway monitors, making sure they're locking the doors, the external doors at the children's wing, getting windows on classroom doors, or having a policy that doors must stay open at all times. Some are installing cameras, so they're doing a lot with facilities. They're taking it very seriously. And above all, they're seeing improved communication and greater clarity around their responsibility for keeping kids safe, which is ultimately what we really, really want to see. We heard from the teams that it is so important to have committed champions in each congregation to continue to hold up this work, and that we also need to be in prayer about it. So what emerged from one of the tables was prayer and committed champions will get us there. And the structure, the education, and the law gives us the forms and the process. We've got ongoing training. We're posting information on our bulletin boards. We've got correct reporting. And there's almost a celebratory feel to much of what we heard at the convening, that people are feeling proud that this is happening in their churches. So just a couple of quotes that I pulled out from the many that we heard, was, people are saying we no longer rely on the few who know. We all need to act. Jesus has called us. We are mandated by his example to prevent CSA. Churches have a bad reputation. We need to be part of the solution. People of faith are called to be prophets, to speak for the most vulnerable, the children. I am proud to be in a church that takes this seriously. That's what we're tapping into. That's what we're tapping into. So we are seeing people living into this vision. One quote I really loved, because this is where we want people to be headed. We've been through some very challenging discussions, but I think our church has grown and become stronger and more of a safe sanctuary for all, survivors, children, and offenders. That's the vision. That's the vision. And that this is a calling, that we are God's hand and God's feet on this earth. And we put all of this inspirational quotes and more stories and the data in a report that we released in July called 5 Years of Safe Church, Progress and Promise in Changing Culture to End Child Sexual Abuse. It's, it's maybe a 30-page report, but it's really filled with a lot of inspiring things. So if you would like to read it, it's available on our website, and I'll give you the website in a minute. You can download it from there. So as we move into what's next for us, we're participating now with a collaborative in Brooklyn called the Just Beginnings Collaborative, because Ms. Foundation's 5-year cycle has been passed on to Just Beginnings. And they're housed in the Ms. Foundation offices, so it hasn't gone far. But they grew out of a multi-year partnership with Ms. and a big foundation called the Novo Foundation that works to end all forms of interpersonal violence. And so with JBC building on the foundation laid by the first 5 years, we're going to move further into catalyzing this national movement to end child sexual abuse. For us at our local level and our work nationally, we're doing more visibility for safe church congregations, a broader social media reach. We've expanded our team now. I have 3 women working with me at this point. We're doing wisdom circles, not only for survivors, but for allies, asking them similar questions and then comparing how do survivors feel about this versus how do allies feel about this. Allies are people that walk with survivors and or are part of the movement to protect kids from sexual harm. We are currently developing a workshop for our congregations about problematic sexual behavior in children and youth. At this point, research is telling us up to 40% of all child sexual abuse is committed by a person under the age of 18. Under the age of 18. So we're looking at a lot of child-on-child and teen-on-child abuse. We want to know how we can recognize problematic behavior and step in before that behavior is acted out. So that's one of our next pieces of work. We're working with an expert in the field on that who's helping us develop a congregational workshop. And so after I've said all of this about movement building, the question is, what do I do now? What do you want me to do? I'm stepping up, now what? Is always the question. You have to make a choice. This is one of the choice questions. But I will say that movement building requires, remember Snoopy and his solo pilot thing? Okay, you can't fly solo. You can't fly solo as a church, as a denomination, as an individual, as any one program. We're not looking to scale up Samaritan Safe Church and make it the program. We're looking to have other people working with faith communities to join into this faith-based movement with secular organizations. And we have to connect the dots. There's some great leaders out there now that are starting to do faith-based work. And so we need to start connecting the dots so we can speak more powerfully with a voice from the faith communities. So what are actions that are movement building actions? Legislative action alerts are one thing we've gotten involved in. Pennsylvania is in the process of trying to reform its statute of limitations for child sexual abuse. And it's the first time we've been deeply engaged with legislation. But for us, it's a matter of allowing survivors access to justice, rather than denying them access to justice in the courts after a very short period of time. And so during the past year, I've spoke at a press conference at the Capitol on it. I've worked with a legislator. We actually circulated a letter to faith leaders in Pennsylvania that was going to go to the Senate Judiciary Committee to advocate for a particular piece of legislation that was very good. And we had a lot of faith leaders sign on from many denominations. That was exciting. But what was even more touching was when survivors saw these leaders, these bishops and pastors sign this letter, they were just, it was like, we can't believe this is happening, that they're actually standing up for us. So I think even more important than the legislative piece of it was what it meant to survivors to see their leaders taking a stand. Certainly you can ramp up your social media about this. You can connect with other activists that are working on ending child sexual abuse, and you can empower adult survivors to heal and to lead in this work, which is what we'll be talking about next session. You have to be relentless. And that's a word that emerged in the community. You have to be relentless, educating the whole congregation about this issue. And some of the topics that we have education sessions on now, child sexual offenders, how they operate, the grooming process, how to intervene, understanding the prevalence and the impacts of CSA, the invisible wounds of adult survivors, red flags, how to skillfully ask a child question, abuse of power, that's a theological problem. Spiritual wounds of abuse, how to respond. There's so much education that we need to be doing in our congregations. And it means to really be involved in movement building. You're called to take a prophetic role, to step into that fire, insist your congregation, move out beyond the status quo. We want those dry bones to rise. We want this to have life, to be infused with the Spirit. Make sure that you use worship resources that include prayers and liturgies and mentions for survivors of child sexual abuse, sexual violence, domestic violence in your congregation as the norm, rather than the exception when it happens to be Domestic Violence Awareness Month or Child Abuse Awareness Month. Forget that. Do it regularly. We can help. We have a pretty big toolbox at this point, so we are always happy to come in and we could train a group of CRC facilitators, and you could integrate some of our frameworks into what you're already doing. You can learn to facilitate our Tamar Speaks retreats, which are amazing, and we so much want survivors to have access to these retreats. You can learn how to facilitate wisdom circles for survivors and allies. You can certainly connect with us. We have a website, just SamaritanSafeChurch.org. We tweet. Our hashtag is Move to NCSA. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can connect with us on Facebook. You can do all of that stuff. because social media is one of the things that we've really understood now, especially for doing connections with younger people, is really important. So we're ramping that up. And I would just close by saying I think there are certain moments in history that theologically we would describe as kairos times, opportunities, windows that open where change is possible. And I believe that at this time in history, this is a kairos moment for us in the church, that God is calling us into that kairos moment, and we have a choice as to whether we'll step through that window and make that path broader and deeper for others. Because if we don't, that moment of opportunity will eventually close. And I think it's a time now when that window is open, that opportunity to build that faith-based stream, to be part of that river, of that bigger social movement that is emerging around ending child sexual abuse.